Hello and welcome to this lecture on trade and gender, part of the Economic Policy Analysis module. Now in a moment I'll show you the structure of the lecture, but first a couple of pictures to look at, three in fact. So you might like to think about as concrete examples, what are we looking at here, what is happening, who is involved, and where in the world are we up there. So pause the video, have a think, and I'll come back to you. So, no points for this, but here we have three examples of the female role in globalization and industrial developments, particularly in rapidly industrializing countries. So, if we start off in the bottom right here, we've got perhaps the example that springs to mind for many people, which is in India and in Bangladesh, women involved in sewing, and this one's a Bangladeshi example. So, it's heavily dominated by women. It's fairly semi-skilled labour, and we'll have some case studies on that later on in the lecture. That's a fairly well-known example. Moving up here, this example here is actually from what I believe to be the biggest factory in the world, Elon Musk notwithstanding. This is the factory in China owned by Foxconn, where they make things like iPhones and iPads. And again, heavily dominated by female, this manufacturing. Also skilled, but this is even more technically skilled, and again a huge source of growth and economic dynamism and employment opportunities for the women, but also has been quite controversial. This made the news when people photographed nets around the top of the towers where these people are living, because it's like a small city. The first figure I read on this was 8,000, and I thought that's a large factory, but 8,000 was the figure that turned up the last time they announced vacancies. And there are pictures of crowds of women at the gates, or other people. And inside the factory they have 250,000 workers, so it's like a small city. But these two both manufacturing. Up here we move to another area of globalisation and women's role, which is the service centre. So we've got a service centre, it's a call centre. So whenever you ring your bank or so on, and you think maybe you're talking to someone who's living down the road, often of course it could be someone overseas. So it's female dominated. As to the question of where it is, it's kind of a trick, but in the lectures people often get this wrong, but you have plenty of time to see that even though it says offshore call centre in India, you might have thought about this and realised it's not actually India, it's in Philippines. So this is an example of south to south global investment. So a developing country, India, investing in another developing country, the Philippines, and putting together this call centre and selling the services all around the world. But the thing that all three have in common is that they're heavily dominated by female labour force. Okay, so that's some concrete examples of what we're going to be discussing. But in terms of lecture outline, first of all we'll look at gender economics. So is economics not a gender neutral thing about people making rational decisions? Well, guess what the answer is going to be. Why do we have gender in economics at all? And what are the different perspectives that economists have taken at micro and macro levels on this? Then we move into trade and gender, looking at the evidence as opposed to conceptual stuff. And this is really based on two kinds of evidence: the cross-country regressions, econometric evidence, and detailed case studies. And I recommend you look at both. And then finally, we look on what are the conclusions and the policy implications that flow from all of this. So hopefully we can get started with trade and gender in economics. So, question is here. If economics is about decision making, about scarce resources, do men and women make different decisions? And of course, economists and many others have investigated with games, but particularly in recent years, economists. And one of the things that have been at the forefront of this is games of various sorts. So, they've got the ultimatum game, the dictator game, and the trust game, and the public goods game. Now, you guys are unlucky, A, because you're not here, because we have lockdown, but also at the undergraduate level, we play these games in class for, admittedly small amounts, but real money, and people can go away with the winnings at the end of the class, because that class is a big one, 40 or 50 students at least. But for you, I'll just have to deal with verbal presentation. So, the ultimate game, to refresh your memory, is the one where it's a pairs game. So person A in the pair is given a sum of money, say £10, and they can decide how much they're going to offer to player B. And player B in a good setup is someone that they don't know who player B is. Player B does not know who player A is. So, but player A just knows that he or she are going to make an offer to player B. So, for example, player A might offer £4 or £3. Then the play changes to player B. Player B is told that this anonymous player A was given £10 and they've decided to offer you £3. Your choice is to accept or not accept. If you accept it, then you will get that £3. Player A will keep the remaining £7. However, if you reject it, you will get nothing at all and they will get nothing at all. So player B decides to accept or reject. Dictator game is exactly the same setup except far simpler in that player B simply accepts whatever they're given. They've got no chance of rejecting it. The trust game I'm going to describe later on, and the public's good game I'll describe later on as well, but they measure some way of capturing this idea of trust and the idea of capturing public cooperation. So public's good game is played with more than players, typically 4. And to start off with, I'm going to show you the results from the classic studies, which are the ones maybe you should take more seriously, and just for interest, the results that happen when we play it with a small group of students in Dev. So I think it's Sarah Eckel, I can't remember the first name, but she's the one that's done a lot of both her own studies and quite authoritative roundups of evidence from around the world, different studies. And she found that in the ultimation game, the average off-row, when people are given £10, they offer about £3.75. I think it's probably dollars actually. But she found some differences. She found that women tend to offer in that situation more than men. And unlike the students' versions, these are based on many studies, large numbers. So there seems to be a small and yet persistent difference found between what women and men will offer. So in an economic situation, you're thinking, how much are you going to put on the table to offer the person you're doing a transaction with? Typically, women are likely to offer more than men. That was mirrored, mostly it has been mirrored in the students. There was one class here where it flipped the other way. And I don't, but it's the same both times, so it was consistent and fine. When we turn to the dictatorship game, you notice that for a start, at an overall level, people tend to offer much less, and that's natural because this time there's no chance of being rejected. So you can just give whatever you want to give. And she found that the difference is even more marked. It's a fairly regular 2-to-1 ratio that women would offer twice as much as men would offer. There's no chance of any comeback. They don't know each other. The person can't reject or complain in any meaningful way. They just give or don't give, and women tend to give more. And I think that didn't stand up here. It did stand up here. So that's not quite so robust in our class. Bearing in mind that in our undergraduate class, usually it's like 47 women or something and 4 men. So it's very, very skewed. And here's the results in the ultimatum game of looking at, this is about who gives, and this is looking at the sex of the receiver. So Eckel finds on average that women, are, as well as offering more, they tend to be offered less. And sometimes we agree with that, sometimes we don't among the students. Yeah. But the headline here is that on the overall level, without considering the sex of the people, it's surprising for a start, because you'd imagine that in terms of economic rationality, what should the economically rational amount be in situation, ultimatum game, the first one, and in the dictator game situation? Think about that and pause for a second. What's the economically rational amount to offer in each case? You think about that. The answer you should have come up with here is that in dictatorship game, the economically rational amount to offer is 0. You're just maximising your personal income, you should get 0. This is taking it economically rational in a very narrow sense. In the ultimatum game, the economically rational amount is not 0 because the person will just reject. But if you offer them 1 pence, it's rational for them to accept. Therefore, it's rational for you to accept 1 pence. This has been played around the world, and no one has ever found any level of offer anywhere near that low. So people as a whole, they're not in that simplistic sense economically rational. But of course many, and I would argue that you can look on economic rationality in a more sophisticated way than that. So that's the overall level. But at the sex level, in terms of gender differences, we do find consistent differences in terms of women offering more, giving more, and being offered less. And if you just drew a line down that, and accepted that from this lecture, and imagined the consequences that would take place if that is really reflected in the way that men and women deal in the economy, in the millions and billions of transactions that happen each year, that would be enough to explain a lot. So these are enormously significant results, significant in the socially significant sense. Okay, so they tried to go into more detail, looking at differences between men and women in all these different fields to say, well, what's explaining what goes on here? So again, I suggest you pause the video for a second and think, what are the differences you would expect to find in these areas between men and women, and how might they have been looked into? And as well as the differences you might expect to find, you might like to think about what causes those differences, and if you can get a handle on the causes, what are the possible effects of those differences existing in society? And from that you might like to think about policy. So if you find there are these differences, they have some effects, of what policy-wise could you do to, if you think it's a bad effect, to minimise it? So let's take one by one. So in terms of altruism, so we found that in dictatorship games, or dictator games and similar things, it seems well established that that women do give more than men. And there are some doubts. People have said, well, perhaps this is publication bias, particularly because these games have been played in research which is exploring many things beyond the idea of sex, or not particularly looking at sex. So it could be that somebody has done a big series of games, and whatever it was they're investigating, they found, well, no significant results. So they're going to bin those results, put them in the drawer, not really worth publishing, funders won't be happy. But then someone notices, hey, wait a minute, there's a difference between men and women here. And they look at it and say, yes, there is, test it, it's significant, and they publish it. And of course, that's some sort of data mining or publication bias, because if you do enough group comparisons, then sooner or later you're going to get what's significant. You decide to publish that. So some people have raised doubts about some of the published studies finding this, but I think that it comes up so often that it's hard to discount entirely, that there is some difference between men and women when they give in terms of altruism. But of course, why that is it biological, socially conditioned, institutionally driven? We don't know. But there is evidence on that, which we'll get to. So, altruism. Women seem to give more than men. How about cooperation? Well, this, I said, is studied very widely using various public goods games. And we'll get to an example of one later on in Kenya. This one finds that, in actual fact, in terms of the contribution of men and women to published goods, if you control effectively for different factors, there's no real or very small remaining gender difference. But in certain specific contexts, like the Kenyan one, there can be enormous differences, and that can have enormous real-world implications on what we observe in economic and social behaviour. So bear that in mind when we get to the Kenya example later. Assertiveness. In terms of the simplest one is just that in the ultimatum game, men or anybody seems to be able to get away, or feel they can get away, with offering a lower amount to women because they are less likely to reject. And the data shows, even some years, the data in the classes shows that women accept really very tiny amounts compared to what the men accept. So again, big applications in terms of accepting lower rates of pay, for example, if you're in a job situation. They've played these games in terms of getting men and women to do simple strategy playing games on computers matched up, or doing mathematical games. And they find that women systematically will select the more routine, less challenging task, preferring to get a guaranteed return rather than risking for a higher return. And rather than saying that I'm the one that can take on the more difficult role, they'll take on perhaps the following role. The one that I found particularly illustrates this in the article I'll show you in a moment is the advising game one, where they got a group of men and women to play a computer-based strategy game, like a one-on-one paired game. So they had all the possible combinations, so everybody played everybody else in a kind of league situation. So after they'd done that for a sufficient period, they had a pretty good idea of who ranked from top to bottom, regardless of males and females, who were the best players down to the worst players, having played each other, different combinations. Then they repeated this, again, everybody playing everybody else, except this time, as well as two people being matched up to play each other, each person would also have another player from the same pool matched up to be a possible advisor. So you've got two people who are playing against each other, and then each person has got someone advising them, and that person is able to send the messages on the computer to say, hey, in this situation you might want to watch out for this, or consider this, or try this, giving them advice. And what they found is that, and you may be very surprised by this, but the women spoke up far less than the men. Even when, if you compare a male and a female, the female maybe could be one of the ones where when they played the initial one-on-one, she was one of the top performers, thrashed a lot of the other players, including the men, one of the top people. But she'll be watching some other black player, a woman or a male play, and she'll hardly say anything. Won't butt in and give advice. Whereas the other person advising could be a guy who's one of the more hopeless players, but he'll just be all the time coming up with a stream of advice. Hey, do this, try this, try this. This is, no, you're going all wrong there. Even though, objectively speaking, we know that he's useless. So that surprised me a lot. Another one about competitiveness, specifically competitiveness. So they had people in small groups, I think it was 4 or 6, and there were 2 options for being paid. And these tasks were just a sheet with a series of simple mathematical calculations or sums, like additions, multiplications and so on. And what you had to do was do as many as you can in the time allowed. And you choose how you're going to get paid. First of all, they played it saying you get paid according to how many you complete, just you, according to your performance, regardless of everybody else. Then they repeated it, doing with, you get a more payment, but only if you're the best in the group. So the best person in each group got paid more, no one else got anything. But then after that, they said, okay, we're going to do it a third time. This time you can choose, do you want to be paid according to your own individual performance, or do you want to have this bigger payment only if you're the best in the group? And what do they find? 2 times more men than women chose to go into the being paid if you're the best. And then they did some follow-up stuff, asking them, well, where would you rank yourself? How likely do you like your to win? And there were groups of 4 now, I remember the figures, because about 20-24% of women said, yeah, I'm probably in the top 4, so I probably would win that one. I have a chance because I'm in the top 4. So women were estimating their ability about right, but the men, 83% of the men said, yeah, I'm probably one of the top 4 in this, and put themselves forward to be in the competition. Again, staggering. And finally, as used to risk. Now I put this last because it's often something that people pick out, and indeed in a later study it's something that someone found. But according to this large meta-survey of research, even though it's been studied in a variety of games and situations, basically all of them saying, so would you go for a fixed small payment or a larger one subject to risk, that kind of situation. They do find indeed that on average there's a persistent risk-averse disadvantage of women, or then more, if you call it, some people argue it's an advantage, they're more risk-averse on average, but the size of the effect is quite variable, and also it's quite small, so you wouldn't expect it would have a big effect relative to other things that are going on. So it could be that here there is a stable effect, but it's not really it's not so important as some of these other effects which seem more startling. And this is what I recommend you read. Quite a recent study, amazing professor in the States who's both does her own research and has got an amazing summary, a mind-blowing website resource on all this stuff. And also, these tend to be results of what actually happens. These are the interpretation. And emerging evidence that it's not about your biology or about even socially conditioned stuff that influences your decisions. It's about your belief in what other people are going to do because of their beliefs about what you're going to do, which are gender structured. Okay, I'll have a quick pause here and then we'll get on to trust games.